It's really difficult to tame animals of any wild species because the critical period for social imprinting is very short. It has to be short. It's not a biological mistake because outside of Disney movies, it's a really bad idea for an animal to grow up making friendships with members of other species.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 195th episode of this podcast about anything and everything that you can do to help the better workings of your own brain, or in this case, a little bit of an oddball episode about the better understanding of a brain that possibly lives in your house, eats food from your table, or perhaps under your table. But if you have one, is certainly very, very close to you and your family. We're talking about man's best friend, the dog. Actually having a dog brains episode, which of course we have to entitle this episode DOGNITION. But there are more than a few scientists out there who make careers out of studying dogs, dog behavior, the breeding lines of various dogs, lots and lots of things to be learned. And we're going to be speaking with two guests in this episode, each of whom carries serious street cred in the world of dog science, Doctors Clive Wynne and Monique Udell. So dogs, wolves, and how their brains work in this Dog Days of Summer episode. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you what we know about how dogs of different ages respond to dog-directed speech. Should you really be talking to your puppy in a puppy voice that differs from the voice you use with your adult dog? Stay tuned for that in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So a recent study published in the journal Behavioral Genetics looked at something which on the face of it looks almost like an oxymoron, the determinism of creativity. We think of creativity as being this unfettered, boundary-breaking, can't be bottled or lassoed down sort of thing. But then we have this sticky circumstance of seeing that oftentimes creativity tends to travel in packs when it comes to human families. Creative parents have creative children, you have a hodgepodge of creative siblings, that kind of things happen sometimes. And of course you could chalk that up to nepotism, you could chalk it up to just a learning environment that encourages creativity, or of course you could do a twin study. And the latter route, of course, is what this study did. These data were examined by researchers at the University of Oxford Computer Science Department and the Department of Biological Psychology at Amsterdam University. And they were looking at data that had been collected as part of the Netherlands Twins Register, of which around 1,800 were monozygotic, otherwise known as identical twins, and 1,600 were dizygotic twins, so in the womb at the same time, but no more genetically related than a regular brother or sister, but of course born at the same time to the same family in the same circumstances growing up. And of course, creativity is sort of a tricky thing to judge. The researchers used the fairly restrictive binary coding of yes or no that a person was creative if their profession fell into the categories of dance, film, music, theater, the visual arts, or writing. That would get you a yes as being a creative, anything else would get you a no. And then they looked at the professions of these adult twins to see if one twin was in a creative profession, what did that do to the likelihood that the other twin was also in a creative profession, and how did those proportions differ between identical and non-identical twins? First of all, ticking that box yes as being a professional creative was fairly rare in the study. Only 2.6% of the twins actually fell into that category. But if one of a pair of identical twins did fall into that category, did have a creative profession, then there was a 68% chance that their twin did as well. However, if their twin was a non-identical twin, this percent dropped to 40%, so 68% down to 40% based on having a 100% DNA match versus a 50% DNA match in the dizygotic twin. After crunching all the numbers there on the differences between those two twin pools, researchers say that 70% of that professional level of creativity is attributable directly to genetic influences. Just for some context, other research groups looked at the heritability of creative writing. They looked at people who made their livings in letters, books, and manuscripts. They found that the heritability there was at a rather shocking 83%, and German data sets showed a reasonably high 62% for perceived creativity, which isn't necessarily how creative you are. It's how creative you think you are, which of course might not be the same thing. And of course, the researchers acknowledge one difficulty with this study is finding the right proxy that they can actually measure from their data set to hold up and say, hey, this person is creative. There are obviously a lot of very creative people that don't work in one of those 5 professions, either because they are very good at something else, or that despite being very creative, there's something about that type of workplace, what it takes to actually hack it and make a living, some aspect of the creative profession that they're not good at despite their actual creativity being high. Some of that stuff is just tough to track. But for creative professionalism, according to this, 70% of it, if somebody's in one of those jobs, they can thank their genes.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, We have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes this week. Listener Zero Infinity 777 from the USA says, "This show's production quality and structure is perfect and easy on the ears, and the information on nutritional and nootropic compounds can be found nowhere else." And listener Jose Suave from Canada says, "I would like to take this opportunity to request that an episode be done on Vyvanse. Ritalin and Adderall have already been covered, but Vyvanse hasn't, and this happens to be the one that I'm prescribed with. Thank you and much love." Normally, iTunes reviews aren't probably the easiest way to get a hold of me, but I do read them, so maybe I'm wrong. But if you do have an episode request, you can just email me at jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. That's JESSE. No I's, no Y's. But thank you very much to both of you. Thanks to everyone that's been leaving reviews on Smart Drug Smarts, including the good old-fashioned word-of-mouth reviews just left in somebody else's ear. But whatever you've been doing to spread the word on Smart Drug Smarts, a big, big thank you. Smart Drug Smarts has a mailing list. It's called The Brain Breakfast. You can get signed up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. We had a big piece last week about the solar eclipse, which I was lucky enough to see. It was totally cool. Quite honestly, a lot cooler than I thought it was going to be. It's not something that I would have traveled for with the expectations that I had going in. I was like, it'll look cool, but ultimately, what's the big deal? But now that I've seen one, I probably would travel for one in the future. Quite weird, and one of those things that photos just don't really do justice. Another thing that photos almost never do justice is pills. The bane of every supplement manufacturer out there, I'm sure. How do you take an exciting action shot photo of this thing, which is ultimately just a rounded cylinder? These, among other challenges, are those that are met and surmounted by the fine folks over at Axon Labs and Vitamunk, the two supplement sponsors of Smart Drug Smarts. Axon Labs, as you probably know, has a couple of stacks, Nexus and Mitogen. Nexus, a cognitive stack built around a 1-2 punch of aniracetam and CDP choline. Mitogen, a mitochondrial booster. You can find both of those over at axonlabs.io. And at Vitamunk.com, you'll find a wide range of supplements, over 30 supplements on their shelves right now and growing. On the Vitamunk launch list that I've mentioned before, they released this week an extract of artemisinin, possibly better known as sweet wormwood, something people use as a natural anti-inflammatory for joint health, among other things. A lot of different supplements over there, full spectrum stuff, not just for the brain, but of course, a lot of brain-centric products too. Alpha GPC is another of their biggies. You can check out the Vitamunk at Vitamunk.com.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So as you know, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, I'm fairly promiscuous in my interest in all things scientific. This podcast is ostensibly about smart drugs and cognitive enhancement in all its ways, shapes, and forms, but every now and then we'll run a bit off the rails. And a few months ago, Michelle said, "Hey, Jesse, I see this study about cognition in dogs. Is this something that we're interested in?" And I thought, well, there's a lot of dog lovers out there. Between dog lovers and cat lovers, probably 70% of all the people out there fall into one of those two camps, if not both. We're calling this the Dog Days of Summer episode, even though it's actually probably a little bit past the hottest part of summer. That phrase, the Dog Days of Summer, by the way, has to do with the dog star Sirius. It's a phrase that goes way back, deals with the zodiac. Doesn't really have a heck of a lot to do with dogs, but that was enough of an excuse for us to put the episode in summertime. And we're going to be talking with a couple of dog cognition experts. Dr. Clive Wynn is a psychology professor at Arizona State University, where he is also the director of the Canine Science Collaboratory, and he's also the director of research at a place called Wolf Park, where the name pretty much says it all. And our second guest, Dr. Monique Udell, is an assistant professor with the Department of Animal and Rangeland Sciences at Oregon State University. She studies human-animal interactions in the development of social bonds and cross-species communication. This is the kind of work that on the face of it seems very earthy and animal lover sort of stuff, and probably is, but also might have a lot of bearing in the present and certainly the near future on how we design the interfaces in robots and other AI systems. So all this earthy nature stuff could get very techy very quickly. So wag your tail, jump up and down, and say hello to Drs. Clive Wynn and Monique Udell.
My understanding from archaeologists, geneticists, we don't believe that people created dogs in the first instance. What probably happened was that sometime during the last ice age, maybe 15,000 years ago, our hunter-gatherer ancestors in certain places discovered locations that were so rich that they could settle down. And once they became settled, they started doing what is characteristic of human beings. They started creating piles of trash. And those piles of trash attracted many different animal species. But anyway, in some parts of the world, wolves joined the fellowship of animals that started scavenging on our ancestors' trash. And as they did that, they placed themselves into a new niche, and they placed themselves under a new set of selection pressures. And those selection pressures are what, in the first instance, created dog-like animals, created animals that were no longer clearly wolves.
How many wolves are there out there, and how many of them are available to researchers?
That's an excellent question. And part of the answer to that question is, what do we mean by wolves? So there's actually more than one species of wolf. So if we look not only in North America, there are multiple species, but then there's also species of wolves around the world. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but if you look at the range of those animals that we can actually work with, at least for studies like this in terms of social cognition, where we need to be able to potentially go in with the wolves and interact with them, we're talking about a relatively small number.
My suspicion is that our ancestors initially were not very happy having wolves hanging around the edge of their encampments, but there was nothing they could do about it. And in time, they came to realize that their resident wolves were not as big and scary and dangerous as the outside wolves and bears and other animals. And these resident wolves would make a fuss when unfamiliar wolves, or for that matter, unfamiliar people, came close to your encampment. And that was the beginning of a useful relationship.
It's interesting to think also that because there were dogs present in both the Americas and the Old World, is the conventional wisdom that dogs crossed over with humans on the Siberian land bridge when humans first came to the Americas, or that dogs were sort of independently were domesticated or self-domesticated or whatever from local wolf populations in both Eurasia and the Americas?
This is going a bit beyond my range of expertise, but I'm pretty certain that the dogs in the Americas came with humans over the Bering Land Bridge, that it was not an independent domestication event. I'm pretty certain. But that remains up in the air with different groups. The geneticists never seem to be able to agree with each other. And, you get different postulated places of origin of dogs, and you get argument over whether dogs arose only once or arose on multiple occasions in different parts of the world.
And I think it's really important to recognize that most of the research that has been done on dog cognition has been done with a very small subset of the domestic dog population as well. So typically those sorts of research studies are done with pet dogs. And pet dogs only make up a small proportion of the world's population of dogs. In fact, the great majority of the world's dogs, something like 3/4 of the world's population, are actually free roaming scavengers.
Wow.
It's actually pretty similar then when you compare then the types of wolves that we're looking at, these hand-reared wolves that have this bond with humans, they're not the same as necessarily the worldwide population of wolf that is living a wild-type existence. But when you're making comparisons between the dogs that we live with, and you're trying to understand what components of their behavior might be influenced by genetics versus life experience, then you really then have to try to compare those dogs, our pet dogs, with wolves that have had similar positive social experiences with humans.
That is a really fascinating statistic that you just said, that 3/4 of the world's dogs are essentially wild dogs. That implies that, depending on how you look at it, that dogs are better adapted to life on planet Earth than things like wolves, which is interesting since dogs, I guess, started out in the symbiotic relationship with humans and have an active life beyond that, or at least not living directly as human pets.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually not only true of domestic dogs. They're all genetically domesticated, but they are living that free roaming sort of wild existence in much of the world. You can find the same thing in other urbanized animals. So if you think about pigeons, or you think about rats, or you think about squirrels, urbanized animals, animals that do well in human environments, even if they're not living as pets, often do really thrive in terms of population numbers compared to some of their wild counterparts.
Strictly biologically, are all dogs still the same species? Can you still interbreed any two dogs from any poles of the dog phylogenetic universe, a Mastiff with a Chihuahua, and still get a fertile offspring?
Not only are all dogs part of the same species, they are actually all part of the same subspecies. So today, dogs are no longer spoken of as Canis familiaris, which is what we were taught in school. For, at least a decade, 2 decades, dogs have been classified as a subspecies of wolf. So dogs are Canis lupus familiaris. And in fact, dogs and wolves can and do interbreed and create viable offspring. And so do all the species in the genus Canis. So coyotes, jackals, wolves, dogs, dingoes, New Guinea singing dogs, they are all capable of and do interbreed and produce viable offspring. One thing I find very surprising and interesting is that all modern breeds are a creation of just the last couple of centuries. The notion of a breed as we understand it today as a closed breeding population where you must not breed your German Shepherd to a dog that is not also registered as a German Shepherd, that is a much more recent phenomenon than most people seem to realize. So it actually, the first dog show in the modern sense took place in 1859, which is the same year as the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species by coincidence.
Domestic dogs, by and large, are capitalizing on a specific niche, which is around or within human settlements. And this is true back from when they were first domesticated in the range of 14,000 years ago, all the way up until present day. You typically find them in fairly close proximity to humans and utilizing human resources for survival, even if humans aren't necessarily directly caring for them or taking them in as pets.
So as far as your studies of dog cognition and wolf cognition and pitting the two against one another, seeing where those differences lie, tell us some about that. What were you expecting to find? What have you seen?
Yeah, so I've done a range of studies with dogs and wolves and comparisons. And when we initially started with this research, we were interested in looking at aspects of social cognition that were thought to be really important to the dog-wolf distinction. So it had been suggested that, for example, dogs would be really responsive to human gestures, to body language, to our vocal commands. And so a lot of our early research was focused on trying to understand how successful human-reared wolves would be on these various tasks. And what we found is that in many cases, wolves are very good at social cognition tasks, which makes sense because they engage in really complex social interactions with each other as well. The recent studies have been a little bit different. We kind of have taken a step back and said, where do we see these characteristic differences in wolves and dogs crop up most commonly? And one of those areas is that dogs, through domestication, are more juvenile in their behavior than wolves. And this can be represented in a number of ways. And one very noteworthy way is the amount of time they spend in close proximity to people or other companions, and the amount of time they spend looking at, or we could even view it as gazing or staring at their companions. If you think about a human child and how they're just always inquisitively looking up to adults and learning. And we see the same kind of thing in dogs. And so a lot of our more recent studies have been asking the question, maybe it's not that dogs are necessarily smarter than wolves. Maybe it's not that they think more like humans, but maybe they just spend much more time watching us, wanting to be in our proximity, learning from us, and responding to our behavior. And that's what a lot of our more recent studies have been trying to address.
You could see where that would make sense. It's kind of like if you're in a medieval court, it's like everybody's watching the king and the queen to see what they think is cool and then trying to mimic that or use that to their advantage. And it's kind of like that, I guess, if you're a dog living in a human household.
Absolutely. And it's like, in some ways, dogs never grow up. And I think that that is really adaptive for dogs in a number of reasons. One, people really like the childlike aspect of dogs. You know, we want our dogs to be playful and excited when we come home. We want them to watch us. We want them to listen to us. And so those juvenile type characteristics that we see in lots of species, the fact that dogs maintain some of those into adulthood could be really beneficial to them. And then the other side of the coin is that because they spend so much time watching us and seeking our proximity, they have a lot of opportunity to learn those things, to learn what types of things that we expect of them, to learn when it is we're going to do something, like when we're about to leave for work or we're about to go on a walk, or when it may or may not be acceptable to engage with a particular item. And so dogs are really sensitive to these things, and this also helps facilitate their success in human environment.
So in the last couple hundred years where there has started to be much more sort of fenced-in, closed, controlled breeding for the various breeds, and you've seen this differentiation of all the breeds that we have today, I guess maybe talk about some of the effects that we see cognitively on the different dog breeds in addition to the various shapes and sizes.
Sure. So it was in the late 19th century that people really started setting up stud books, closing them. German Shepherd, for example, was developed in the last years of the 19th century. And the guy who did this, a German called Max von Stephanitz, he wrote a book about what he'd done, how he traveled around Germany looking for the perfect example of a German Shepherd dog. And when he found that dog, he bred only from that dog, from that male. So before the modern understanding of biology, breeders thought that the inheritable material only came from the male. They thought of the female simply as the vessel that carried the new generation. In devising the German Shepherd, all registered German Shepherds alive today are descended from this one male dog. So you have phenomenally intense inbreeding, which captures and guarantees the morphology of the animal. It also captures certain disease genes. So I think the number is 2/3 of all golden retrievers die of cancer, and it's a fairly small number of cancers. And that's because along the way, some cancer genes got captured as well as the desired genes for morphology. At some level, there are behavioral differences between purebred dogs. Only border collies and a few other breeds have this intense drive to herd. But what I find more interesting, really, than these obvious and trivial behavioral differences between certain breeds is the fact that if you give dogs a wide-ranging temperament test, what some people would call a personality test, and you assess as many different dimensions of their behavior as you can think of, their inclination to chase a ball, their willingness to play games with people in other ways, their general aggressive propensities, and so on. If you do a wide-ranging temperament test, then actually, there are two major studies, both used over 13,000 dogs. One of the studies found that the amount of variation within a breed was 80% of the variation between the breeds. And the other study actually found more variation within the breeds than between the breeds. So my take home is that actually breed is not as predictive of temperament as people generally naturally assume, especially if you're not looking for a dog to carry out its traditional working role. So you're not looking for a dog to do herding or whatever task these dogs were originally bred for. If you're not looking for those originally bred behaviors, then actually the differences between breeds are not great at all. And furthermore, which concerns me much more, when you're looking at a mixed breed dog, and we know that over 95% of the dogs in shelters are mixed breed dogs, there's no reason to think that even if you could identify which breeds went into those mongrels, there's no reason to think that that would tell you anything useful at all about that dog's behavior.
I guess that lines up pretty nicely with what we know about human brains and heritability, that so many of our mental attributes seem to be highly heritable, but also that overall heritability is spread over so many different individual genes that you can very rarely point to one particular gene and give it credit or blame for how a person turned out, or a dog in this case.
Right. So it's very interesting to compare to the situation with our own species, because back when true bred dogs were being developed, the idea of having true bred humans was also acceptable by educated people. And back in those days, good old bad old days of the British Empire, there were racist expectations that certain races of people were good for carrying things. Other races of people were good for figuring out puzzles, the way the British took Indians to Africa because they thought they needed them to do the more intellectual work that they didn't feel the Africans were good for. All of those kinds of thinking, which are a total anathema today, and we know are just so wrong and pernicious, those kinds of thinking were what was a deep part of, deeply integrated into the creation of closed breeds of dogs. And it's interesting that where in humans, I hope, all the educated people I know have thrown off that thinking about our own species, we still think that way about dogs. Now, to be fair, purebred dogs are much more intensely inbred than any race of human beings ever was. The variation in behavior within breeds is close to, if not greater than, the variation in behavior between breeds, so long as we're excluding from the discussion behaviors specifically bred into certain breeds of dog, like herding and guarding and so on, things like that.
What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about the way that dogs think?
I do not think that dogs have any special kinds of psychological, cognitive adaptations to living with human beings. I live with a dog, and it certainly is true that dogs are remarkably sensitive to what people are doing. And the textbook, what's become the standard case example for this, is that if you put two containers on the ground and you point at one of them, then your dog will go and investigate the container that you pointed at. You can try this with your own dog. It works in 3/4 of all cases that the dogs will do this. And it's been argued that that kind of behavior shows that dogs have a unique understanding of human intentions that no other animal species has. It's been argued that wolves cannot do this. It's been argued that chimpanzees cannot do this. Chimpanzees, of course, are our closest surviving relatives, and they have much larger brains than dogs or wolves. But I do not believe that's true. I think that's a serious misconception. What happened was that people were comparing dogs who live as human companions in homes, who depend on human beings and human actions for the fulfillment of all of their needs. They were comparing those dogs to wolves that were living in captivity but didn't have the same kind of relationship with human beings.
The studies that we do with wolves that are hand raised often range in the number of 10 to 15 animals, because those animals have been raised a very specific way. They've been socialized from the time they're 2 weeks of age and raised with people, and we can go in and we can interact with them much in the same way we can interact with the dogs that we test. And there are little pockets of these human socialized wolves around the world, but less than maybe 100 total that have this degree of socialization. So it does limit our ability in this way.
So with a small handful of research-friendly wolves, how are they being put to use?
So one study that we have been working on recently has been what we call the solvable task. So this originated with a version of a study that had been done by other researchers around the world called an unsolvable task. And it was basically a puzzle box. And in the unsolvable version, what people typically do is they put some sort of food item in a container, and they typically give the dog or the wolf an opportunity to eat out of that container several times, or maybe just knock a lid off to get the food. And then eventually they glue that lid down. So this task now becomes unsolvable.
Just so people can picture this, can you kind of explain what the dogs actually need to do to solve this puzzle?
So basically, it's a Tupperware container. It has a lid on top, it has a rope through the lid, and there's a piece of food inside. And all the dog has to do, or the wolf has to do, is get that container open in some way. So typically by removing the lid, although we've had a few creative canines actually crunch through the container on the side, or shake the container by the rope until the base came off and they had left with the lid in the mouth and then could get at the food. So they can solve this puzzle in any way they see fit. They just have to get this food out of a container. It's actually a pretty simple task. What's interesting is wolves almost always solve this task, and they do it quickly. Their whole trial time is about 2 minutes long. Wolves have no trouble with this. Occasionally, dogs will solve it as well, but the great majority of dogs do not solve this task. And what's interesting is not so much that they don't solve it, but that they barely try. Typically, they're very interested in the food. They'll run up, they'll sniff the container. In fact, they'll do this even faster than the wolves will. You place that container down on the ground, or the owner places the container down on the ground, takes 3 steps back, and within a couple of seconds, the dogs are either looking at their owner, they're laying next to their owner, or they're sitting quietly. Occasionally, they'll explore the room, but by and large, they won't even attempt to solve this task at all. And this is really interesting to us, because what it means is that in these prior studies, it wasn't that these dogs were looking back to the person to help in a time of need. They're simply yielding either to the person being there, exhibiting complete deference to the person, expecting that person to provide for them, or they're just lacking in this individual solving problem persistence, potentially because they're now capitalizing on a niche where they're relying on scavenging or provisioning from people to a far greater extent than we would expect from animals like wolves, who have to actually go and solve these problems themselves.
Did you try it with dogs of varying degrees of hunger? I'm wondering how much food desperation versus, I know my owner's going to give me food in the next couple hours anyway, might play into it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. So in these particular studies, we did not explicitly deprive them of food. We did typically test at times that were not directly following meal times. And both the dogs and wolves were being fed on a normal schedule, at least the owned dogs and wolves. However, we have also done this now with populations of free-living dogs. So dogs that are in India that are living that sort of more wild-type, free-roaming existence. And these are dogs that scavenge for a living. So they're actively looking for food, actively looking for handouts. And what we found is that free-living dogs in India actually were less persistent on the task even than pet dogs. They actually spent longer durations of time looking at the human. So there's something fascinating going on here. And while lifetime experience likely plays a role, we believe that this might be one of those traits that represents a true divergence between dogs and wolves. This proclivity for approaching people and watching people and responding to the actions and behavior of potential social companions over independent problem solving. That is something that we see reliably in dogs that we just don't see in wolves once they reach adulthood.
If an animal is going to be sensitive to what people are doing, that animal needs to have had 2 crucial life experiences. The first thing is that early in its life, during a period that's called the critical period for social imprinting, that animal has to have spent that period of its life with human beings. Only if the animal spends that early period of its life with humans will it come to accept humans as social companions. Will it be willing to form social relationships with human beings? Now, in our dogs, it's so easy to tame a dog. It's so easy to convince a dog that it should accept human beings as social companions. It's so simple that most people never even notice that they do it, right? If you have a puppy in your home, the puppy will, in the natural course of events, come to accept you as a social companion. You don't notice yourself doing anything to enable that to happen. Back in the 50s and 60s, when ethical standards were different, experiments were actually done, and they reared dogs under conditions that they didn't see any human beings until they were 3 months old, by which time this critical period for social imprinting is past. And those dogs, the researchers recorded, behaved in adulthood just like wild animals. And they were absolutely terrified of people, and there was nothing you could do with them. And so they just euthanized those animals. Now, today, I hope, nobody would be willing to do that. We're not going to carry out an experiment and just euthanize the pups because we've created dogs that nobody can live with. That's absolutely unacceptable. But there it is. Back in the 50s and 60s, standards were different. They did this. It proves that one thing a dog needs to have, any animal needs to have, if it's going to respond to human and social companions, is it needs to have had enough exposure during the critical period of social imprinting. Now, in dogs, what makes dogs a domesticated animal is that the critical period for social imprinting is very long. So it's very, very easy to do this. It probably lasts about 3 months. Without replicating this unethical experiment from the 50s and 60s, we won't know exactly how long it is, but it's probably about 3 months long. If you look at a wild animal like the wolf, the critical period for social imprinting is much, much shorter. It's probably something more like 2 to 3 weeks. That's why it's really difficult to tame a wolf. It's really difficult to tame a lion. It's really difficult to tame animals of any wild species because the critical period for social imprinting is very short. It has to be short. It's not a mistake. It's not a biological mistake because outside of Disney movies, it's a really bad idea for an animal to grow up making friendships with members of other species.
Right.
Because you're always either predator or prey or both. And so the only kind of animal that you can afford to have relationships with is your own species. Otherwise, you're going to get eaten, or you're not going to want to eat the animals you need to be eating, or a bit of both.
On the puzzle box task, has there been a test case where dogs were tested with no human around, no researchers or human chaperones or masters, so you could kind of see how they did it when just left to their own devices?
Yes, absolutely. So we also have a version of the test where we give the dog the same puzzle when they're left alone. And what's interesting is we see relatively low levels of persistence in that condition as well. In fact, they persist at about the same level, whether a human is directly present or whether they're alone. Oftentimes, though, when we're looking at pet dogs, what they spend that time doing then is searching for their owner. Even when the person's not physically there, they still seem to be actively attending to those social cues, whether it be the scent that's left in the room or the door that they walked out of. They just still don't attend to that task.
That reminds me of like a little kid that skins their knee and they go look for mom before they start crying. It's like until mom can see them cry, they won't even bother crying.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head again. The behavior that we're seeing exhibited in these dogs is very much like, if anything, what we would expect out of a juvenile. And I think they're really capitalizing on that niche and that response of sort of juvenile type behavior as successful in these environments. It makes them maybe more pro-social in some ways. It makes them more attentive to these stimuli. And they're really sensitive to the fact that people do provide for them, especially these pets, and that, if they're around their people, they're looking at their people, they're seeking their people out, good things tend to happen. And I think that what we see in wolves, it's not that they don't have this capability, but that they outgrow it. And dogs never do. They stay like children forever.
That's interesting. Have you run the study on juvenile wolves to kind of test that theory out?
We've run a number of other studies that are similar in nature with juvenile wolves. And we do find that in many cases, they're showing a pro-social orientation. So they show the attachment behavior. They seek the proximity of people to a much greater extent than they do when they're adults. We haven't run the specific test with a sufficient number of juveniles to make that transition, but we've started collecting data on juvenile dogs, so dog puppies and adult dogs, and we're currently looking also to see if there's a developmental factor for dogs, but it would be fascinating to do in wolves as well.
Can you talk some about the perceptual differences between humans and dogs, how we see and smell and hear the world, and the effects that these differences have on our overall cognition?
Mind you, I don't know if you've seen, I haven't read it yet, but Nature this week or last week has an article claiming that human sense of smell is not as bad as we always make it out to be. I mean, assuming that when I finally read that article, it doesn't radically change my opinion on this topic. Dogs certainly do seem to have a more sensitive sense of smell than humans do. That said, it seems like it's humans that are the odd one out, not dogs. That is to say, we humans seem to pay exceptionally little attention to smell.
Right.
So we humans, being primates, we're very, very visual. We're trichromats. We have 3 color channels. We discriminate colors more finely than most other vertebrates. Dogs, like most vertebrates, are dichromats. That is to say that their visual experience of color is similar to that of red-green colorblind people. They can discriminate yellows and blues from each other, and they can discriminate yellow and blue from red or green. But when we see red and green as quite distinct sensations, to them, that's all part of the same thing. And then their visual acuity is not as good as ours either, although I can't think of a number for that off the top of my head. But certainly their visual acuity is less. I mean, we're talking generalities here. We've done a series of experiments on dog sense of smell. And one of the first things that really surprised me was that although some dogs have a wonderful sense of smell, other dogs do not. And we were at first puzzled by this, and we thought that we were getting something wrong because everything we read just talked generically about dogs having a wonderful sense of smell. But it turns out that for all that there are some dogs have a very fine sense of smell, other dogs do not. We don't have the technology with our behavioral methods to be able to distinguish between the actual perceptual sense of smell in the narrow sense or the motivation to use your sense of smell. It could be that the dogs we tested who were unsuccessful in our tasks, it could be that they did have a sense of smell, they just were not motivated to show us what they knew. But this was surprising because we hadn't had this kind of phenomenon in other studies of other kinds. So I do actually wonder whether it's the case that all dogs are using their sense of smell all the time. Generally speaking, dogs do have a finer sense of smell than human beings, but not radically better than other mammals. They have less vision, and they seem to have better hearing. Again, there's considerable variability from dog to dog, and probably from breed to breed in all of this.
What were the total numbers of dogs and wolves involved in this study?
We've done it with quite a large number over the course of many studies. The original study, we were just comparing 10 pet dogs living in human homes, 10 in a shelter, and 10 human socialized wolves, because at the time, the limiting factor was the number of human socialized wolves that we could directly work with for this sort of research. Since then, we've done several other studies that have had larger populations, so up to 60 dogs in a study, and we've run multiple studies now, so we're in the hundreds of dogs. And it is fascinating because while you do see individual variation between dogs, and you do see individual variation between wolves, the magnitude of difference between dogs and wolves is always robust and it's always very large. So in all likelihood, we're still seeing some combination of lifetime experience, genetic influences, developmental factors. All of those things are always going to interact. When you're talking about any behavior, all of those things are important. But when you see a huge, reliable difference between dogs and wolves in almost every case, even when you're seeing that smaller individual variation within those subspecies, definitely it suggests that there's something interesting there. And not only have we found this, but now we're starting to talk to other research groups around the world who are working with different populations of human socialized wolves on very similar tasks, and they're finding the same thing.
You know what would be interesting is if there's that magnitude of difference between dogs and wolves reliably, it makes you wonder if there's similar, maybe smaller differences that would be persistent across different dog breeds.
Yeah, and there might be. So people have looked at this with the older version of the task, the unsolvable task, And there was some indicator that to some extent breeds could make a difference, especially when we are talking about specific working populations of dogs. So often when you're looking at differences in social cognition or behavior between dog breeds, if you just take a large survey of a bunch of breeds without any sort of rationale for why you're choosing those breeds, you often don't find the differences that you might intuitively expect. Where you typically find the large differences in behavior or cognition between breeds is when you look at those breeds that have been selected, for example, for specific working roles. So we've done studies where we've compared livestock guarding dogs, such as Anatolian shepherds, and herding dogs like border collies or Australian shepherds, and compared them with terriers. And these are going to be dogs that have actually been bred for specific motor patterns or specific types of behavior that the other breeds have been bred to not exhibit. And when you compare those sorts of things, even on these social cognition tasks, even if that wasn't the point of the initial breeding, you do tend to find some differences there. So that's something that we're moving forward and we're looking more at those questions of breed for this particular task. But that has definitely been true on other social cognition tasks.
It seems like as we've separated dogs into different purebred lines, mostly we've been aiming for some version of some person's conception of cuteness. How much have we been mucking things up biologically as we try to turn dogs even cuter?
Right. Well, it's interesting going back at least as far back as the Middle Ages, 500 years ago, 600 years ago, people recognized that there were such things as sight hounds, which were dogs that you took hunting with you, and they relied on their sense of sight to find prey. And then there were scent hounds, which were hunting dogs, which relied on their sense of smell to find prey. So the notion that there are different breeds of dogs with different capacity in the visual or the olfactory domain is a very ancient notion. And the idea that you just articulated, that certain breeds of dogs, because they've been selected simply to be pets, that those breeds of dogs might not have such good senses of smell, that's talked about in the non-technical literature and it comes up in the scientific literature. But we did a study which really surprised me. So there was a paper came out a few years ago looking at the brain of the pug. So the pug is a dog with a very smushed in face. It has no real snout at all. And its brain is actually rotated inside the brain case, and the olfactory bulbs, which are the crucial part of the brain for at least initial processing of olfactory sensation, its olfactory bulbs are much smaller than any other dog. And the authors of this anatomical paper wrote that their anatomical findings explain why pugs have such a poor sense of smell. And at this stage, I was working with my then graduate student, Nathan Hall, and he said, but I'm not aware of any paper that has actually looked at the olfactory capacity of the pug. And we had a very simple olfactory task, which could easily be deployed with different dogs. And so we did a study with a group of pugs, because they're the ones that allegedly have such a poor sense of smell, a group of German shepherds, who are generally spoken of as having a good sense of smell and are the dog of choice for most branches of the United States military and police. So they're very widely used as sniffer dogs. And we also included greyhounds because greyhounds are historically considered a sight hound, a dog that hunts by vision and not by smell. So it seemed like an interesting comparison group to have. And to our total astonishment, the pugs actually performed far better than the other two breeds of dogs. The German shepherds were surprisingly poor, and the greyhounds, we couldn't even get any data from them because they didn't seem to perceive the smell stimuli at all. So at the moment, the dog world is a very interesting world. Now, I'm not actually suggesting that the military should start using pugs as sniffer dogs. There are a whole range of reasons why pugs would be impractical animals to use for that purpose. But in this day and age, isn't it conceivable that we could do genetic studies and identify genes that are responsible for higher levels of success in olfactory tasks and breed dogs that are better at this? It's really surprising to me when so much depends on it. People put their lives in the hands, in the paws of dogs at airports and in military contexts, and yet we're not actually using animals that have been designed by science to be the best that they can be for this.
I imagine that there are people who, when they hear about dogs being tested against wolves, some people are kind of going to be rooting for the dogs. They're the home team. And other people are going to be rooting for the wolves because they're more natural and they're kind of autonomous, I guess, in a way that dogs aren't. And it seems like the studies that you've done, you could kind of interpret dogs not doing as well on this test in one of two ways. You could interpret it as, well, dogs are just lazier and waiting for the handout from humans, and so they give up quicker. Or you could interpret it as dogs are like a good soldier and want to check with their superior officer before they sort of go off half-cocked. Is that just sort of a matter of conjecture at this point, or have you done further studies to try to see which of those two interpretations we should lean towards?
I think any way you interpret it, it's brilliant because dogs are so successful and it's working for them. I think it's maybe a combination of both, that dogs are in a situation where they don't necessarily need to have some of these predispositions for persistence on solvable tasks or independent tasks. Maybe they can be a little bit more vigilant or laid back and conserve energy. If we really think about the natural world, what is successful? Success is being able to be successful while exerting as little energy as possible. If you're looking at efficiency in animals, it's sort of brilliant, right? If dogs have a niche or a strategy where they can now move into people's houses and these people will feed them, will take care of them, will make sure that their health is as good as possible. There are also downsides, too, from the perspective of evolution and biology, because we restrict their breeding or we restrict their social interaction. So it's not that dogs are necessarily thinking through this on an individual level, but on a species scale, if we're going to say, is this strategy effective? We've already talked about the fact that dogs far outnumber wolves worldwide, and they seem to, in terms of biological population numbers, be thriving. And so they're definitely doing something right. So whether we want to interpret that as lazy or less clever, it's working for them. So in some ways, it's just a matter of not which animal or which species is more intelligent. It's a matter of which strategies or which patterns are most effective for a given species, depending on their evolutionary history and those environmental constraints. And so in many ways, the dogs are doing what works for them, and the wolves are doing what works for them or has worked for them in the past. And so it's possible for both species to be doing something that is really brilliant, but just specific to their individual niche.
I assume you've probably heard about a Russian study. This was done, I think, mid-20th century. A Russian scientist that selectively bred foxes to domesticate them.
You're talking about Dmitry Belyaev.
Yes, I am.
Very, very famous experiment. But yes, he did exactly that. Starting in 1959, Belyaev selected in each generation the roughly 5% of friendliest foxes. And these were foxes living in cages. They came from the fur trade. Friendliest 5% of foxes were selected to become the parents of the next generation. And all they did was they walked up to the cages and they recorded how the fox reacted. And generally speaking, a wild type fox reacts with fear. And then if you actually stick your hand inside, it will dart out and bite you. And gradually, even within 4 or 5 years, they started finding that some of the foxes were becoming friendlier, that they would wag their tails like dogs when people came close to their cages. I usually describe it by saying he started in 1959, Belyaev died in 1986, and by the time he died, all the foxes were very friendly towards human beings. I've been there and I've seen these animals, and it's a quite astonishing experience because they're living outdoors in cages just like they always did. They are not hand-reared, although people do come by and interact with them a little bit. And yet, when you go up, they start trembling with excitement as a human gets closer. And when you open the cage, they more or less leap into your arms. It's quite an amazing experience. It really is. And a really powerful demonstration of what selection can do.
So that worked so well. Why don't we do this with more breeds of animals?
Well, there are a couple of levels to that. One is that the population of animals was tens of thousands. At its biggest, he had a facility with tens of thousands of foxes. So that's one part. The other part is that selection is a euphemism for killing animals, because it's not as if they had a massive retirement home for all the foxes that they didn't feel were good enough to breed from. They slaughtered them. I mean, it was expensive keeping them alive. They have to be fed meat. And so every autumn, they decided who would be bred from, and the rest they slaughtered. I think a more reasonable question is, given that people breed dogs, why don't we breed for the things that really matter? Why don't we breed for a gentle temperament, for a good companion? Why do we only breed for the appearance of the animal? That, I think, is a more reasonable question. Insofar as there is breeding going on, why do we breed for the things that we breed for?
So this is going to call for some speculation, but the level of friendliness that he wound up with in those foxes, or the level that we see in dogs now, has that been pushed as far as it could be? Is there a genetic capacity for a certain amount of friendliness, and we've pushed friendly as far as friendly can go, and there's not really an upper limit beyond that? Or might there be a higher ceiling we still haven't seen the world's friendliest dog?
That's a really, really interesting question. It is, as you say, speculation. And I'd really like to be doing more research on this. My feeling is that the friendliest dogs are definitely as friendly as we need them to be. And yet, it's clear that there is still vast phenotypic variability in that dimension, that there are dogs that are much, much less friendly. And those of us that love dogs, we must be careful not to lose track of the fact that dogs do cause immense distress in human societies. The data I have are at least a decade out of date, but the most recent peer-reviewed survey estimated that 13,000 people in the United States go to emergency rooms every day because they've been bitten by dogs.
You're kidding me. 13,000 a day.
Of course, behavior is a very complex phenotypic trait. A lot of these dogs that bite people, they may well be perfectly pleasant dogs in principle, but they've had bad life experiences that have set them up to be difficult to have around people. So it's not as though breeding would fix everything. But as I said earlier, we do breed dogs. We breed dogs solely on their appearance. And that seems such a missed opportunity. We could be breeding for temperament.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Doctors Clive Wynne and Monique Udell for taking the time for those interviews. Every now and then we interview a scientist who has the dream job that would have been like what I wanted to have when I was a kid, and getting to interact with dogs and wolves as part of my actual job description. I think the 10-year-old me would have pretty much done a backflip for that. Kind of nice to get to vicariously converse with somebody who's actually doing that for a living. Really interesting thinking about dogs in this sort of petri dish sense of what works and what doesn't in human-built environments, and just how successful dogs really are in the way that dogs absolutely dwarf wolves as far as population numbers now, and that technically, as Dr. Wynne mentioned, dogs, wolves, dingoes, all these things are still all part of the same subspecies, despite the obvious phenotypic differences from mastiffs and Great Danes to pugs and chihuahuas. And I also really liked Dr. Udell's point about the success of dogs, any way you choose to look at it. Some of these studies we might want to look at and say, well, the wolf did better, but a lot of that is, I think, sort of informed by our individualist, you, the study subject, ought to be able to perform this action mentality, when from a genetic perspective, I mean, the results are in. There are so many dogs. Whatever they're doing is working for them. Maybe they don't perform this one particular task so well. Well, that task is clearly not the be-all, end-all of what it takes to be a good dog. But before you unleash yourself for other things, let's check out one more piece of dog trivia in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So there's this story from the Middle Ages. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not. It sounds like an apocryphal story, but there was some medieval king that wanted to know what the natural language was. Like, are humans naturally meant to speak Latin or something else? And in this experiment that sounds absolutely terrible to modern ears, he had some babies that were born and did not expose those babies to speech at all. They were brought food, they had wet nurses, but people weren't allowed to speak around them, and basically they were emotionally starved children. But the king in this, again, likely apocryphal tale was assuming that by age 5 or something, they would start speaking and we'd find out what language humans are meant to speak. Obviously, it didn't work out that way. The children died. So, sad story, but also probably not true. But I was reminded of that story in thinking about how difficult it is to study some things that are certainly social in context, that you can't find any humans that already haven't been socialized to some degree. And one of these things is the ways that humans talk to babies and dogs and animals. You can't really find out what is the natural register that a human would use when talking to a dog if the human had never come across a dog before, never seen their parents talking with dogs and their parents' dog voices. There's just not really a way to do that experiment. You could do a much less evil experiment where you raise a human human, not in the presence of dogs. It's not quite as bad as not giving the kid human speech. But anyway, nobody's doing that experiment anytime soon. So scientists are left to ponder and to study what it is about dog-directed speech that is or isn't unique to what humans do for infant-directed speech when we're talking to human infants versus speech for everybody else, speech that we intend for people that can speak back to us at an adult level. Infant-directed speech in humans is known to be at a higher pitch and with a slower tempo than we normally use. This is particularly effective at getting an infant's attention, and it's believed to promote language learning. And it turns out that, as a rule, there's a heck of a lot of similarity between the way that humans talk to our infants and the way that we talk to our animals. Although it's funny, I'm imagining myself talking to a reptile or a goldfish or something like that, and I don't feel like I'd use my dog voice for that. But a transatlantic research team at the University of New York and the University of Lyon looked at dog-directed speech and its effects on dogs of various ages. And their results showed that puppies are highly reactive to dog-directed speech, as opposed to normal human speech or speech in a normal human vocal register, even if it is directed towards the dog. Whereas older dogs really don't distinguish between doggy talk and regular talk directed towards the dog. So all that extra effort going, oh, doggy, doggy, to an adult dog, they could take it or leave it. The researchers suggest that people might consciously or unconsciously want to make themselves better understood by their dogs when they use dog-directed speech, and that they might also be trying to promote word learning by doing this, since this is the style of speech that we use when we're teaching human infants language. They also point out that we use similar speech strategies when we're speaking to people who we think might not be able to fully understand us, like elderly people who are hard of hearing or linguistic foreigners. Although I don't know if I agree with this, because talking to a grandparent or somebody from another country and using my dog voice, that would seem extremely offensive, but kind of funny. But anyway, takeaway finding is that doggy speech is good for puppies, but when you're talking to your adult dog, you can give it to him straight if you want, talk to him just like an adult.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that was it for episode number 195 of Smart Drug Smarts. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find everything online that we talked about here up at smartdrugsmarts.com/195. If you missed last week's episode, I spoke with Dr. Brett Wingeier about his work with implantable brain technologies, work he did at the company Neuropace to help incurable epileptics, and also where he sees implantable brain technology as being capable of going in the future. And next week, I think we're going to be doing the second part of our first ever father and son Smart Drug Smarts interview, or we've interviewed the father, now the son's coming up next, both of whom are scientists, of course. I guess I'll just dangle that as bait and not reveal who the previous guest is yet, but that'll be next week in episode number 196. I will see you back here then, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.